Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and I like to talk about books, book reviews, reading vlogs, things like that. So if any of that interests you, then please subscribe. But today I'm going to be doing just a plain old book review on the book Holly by Stephen King. So this was I feel like this was an anticipated book, but I also feel like the release of it flew a little bit under the radar. Like, I didn't hear a ton of fanfare about it, but it is a really new release. So I'm gonna do kind of my typical format where I'll do like a synopsis summary and then I'll get into my review. But this is gonna be a pretty brief synopsis. It's not going to have spoilers. It's going to be very just like bare bones to kind of let you know what it's about, and then I am going to get into my review. I have kind of a lot of thoughts on this and it's a little bit more mixed than I thought it was going to be, but let's just get into a little bit of a synopsis. Holly by Stephen King follows Holly Gibney, our detective, who we also saw in The Outsider as well as Mr. Mercedes, and in this book she is working on a bunch of disappearances that happen in this one area it's like a college town. I actually forget exactly the name of the town, but it's like a college town and there are all these people who've disappeared, but what's kind of unique about it is that there's no like set type of person who's disappeared. Like, I feel like typically it's like little boys ages 8 to 10 or something. Like, there's usually a little bit more of a type when there's like a bunch of disappearances, but this one, it's like at first the disappearances aren't even really linked together, and Holly is actually the one who starts to link them and is like, wait a second, a bunch of these have certain similarities, like abandoned bikes, abandoned modes of transportation. A lot of the people did disappear in the same area, and so she kind of links together that these are obviously all probably related, but the whole time she's hemming and hawing and kind of going back and forth. Are they though? Was this the same person? And we kind of know who it is the whole time. So it opens with this guy getting abducted, and we know that it is this elderly couple in the area and they're both professors at the school. So I really like that juxtaposition of knowing right away. And really the reality is we're not trying to figure out obviously who did it. We know who did it. We're trying to figure out how Holly figures it out and what's going to happen with Holly and what's going to happen with their story. And so we know pretty early on why they're taking these people. That's that. So we actually get the perspective of a bunch of different characters. We get the perspective of this older couple, Emily and Rodney. We get the perspective of their victims, like the people that they're taking. And of course we get the perspective of Holly. And so it's just really interesting. I love the way it unfolds. I think it is like great horror. The concept in and of itself is just great horror, and I'm not really gonna get into more of it because I really don't want to give a lot away, but I'm gonna get right into my review because I actually have, like I said, quite a few thoughts on this. Right away, one of my first things was like, this book takes place in the thick of the pandemic when there were tons of lockdowns, I think right like before and then right after vaccines came out. So this is like a hallmark of the book, for better or worse. I think that to some degree I liked that. It really brought me back to those scary early stages, which does add this extra layer of fear. And I think sometimes we forget at this point how scared a lot of us were in the beginning, like pre-vaccines and everything, and it was a scary time. So, and I think a lot of people forget that. I was pregnant during that time, so I was really scared, and then I had a little baby, so for me it was really scary. That that setting around a horror story does add kind of that extra layer of anxiety and fear. And I think that in some ways that can kind of aid the story. And then in this story, Holly specifically has just lost her mother, who was like a COVID conspiracy theorist. As much as it's interesting that it takes place during peak COVID, I also think that there is a little bit too much like schadenfreude. You know what I'm trying to say. When her mom dies, like, everyone's like, oh, she was an anti-vaxxer, like, or she died of her own stupidity, things like that. This happens multiple times, and it happens enough in the plot that he even addresses it in an author's note at the end. And I think that it was a little harsh for me. I don't know that it's really nice to like be super happy that people who were maybe fed misinformation died. Like, at the end of the day, COVID deniers getting sick back then especially, and like anti-vaxxers getting sick and passing, I just feel like that's already not aging well in this story. Like, that is just not aging well. Like, we are past some of that frustration. Those people are victims. They're not just victims of the virus, they're victims of like misinformation as well. And like, that's not the way I want to approach that, but I remember that frustration, and I remember feeling that way, especially when I was like had a new baby and all of those things. I remember some of those feelings, and I quickly had to readjust and be like, oh no, like, these people have been fed lies. Like, they are victims, and we should not be happy when they're sick, and we should not be happy when they're passing. And I almost felt like this book just really, that just like didn't sit well with me. It kind of gave me the ick, and I think he knew that that wouldn't sit well with people, and he did put an author's note at the end. That didn't make it any better, and he said this is the perspective of the characters, but the issue is that perspective is represented as being okay and being kind of right and acceptable, versus like Rodney and Emily's perspective, understandably, obviously, is presented as being wrong, but like, I don't know. It just didn't sit very well with me. I do think the horror components of the book were really well done, so it's not like it ruined the book for me, but it did kind of like give it a little bit of an ick for me. I just didn't love that. But that out of the way, like, the horror components I'm obsessed with. I think it's such a spot on, not over the top at all story. I feel like it's really, really like such an insidious kind of subtle little horror, and just like really, really a great concept of this elderly couple. I actually think that it's got a really great commentary on aging in our society, and like this fear that we have of getting older and aging. That's brought up just enough that it feels like spot on, and I feel like that whole concept of like basically being willing to do something like this to like avoid aging and like getting old, like that in and of itself is such a commentary in our society. I feel like it's really quite captivating, and it's like immediately captivating as a story. I do like Holly's character. I feel like she's a pretty enjoyable character to read and to see what's happening with her. One thing I will say is there seemed to also be like kind of an attempted commentary on racial justice slash injustice. I feel like the way it's like nonchalantly thrown in, it almost feels like very shoehorned, like very wedged, very forced. There would have been ways to do this a lot more subtly, and there were some times where it was subtly thrown in, and that was great, fine. But then there were so many times where it was like, felt like a little over the top, and like maybe it should either be like a larger component or omitted, or like, I don't know, I just felt like there was a better way to do that. I kind of feel like this was just not his best way to address some of these things. There just wasn't subtlety, there wasn't any like nuance involved in some of it. Like Emily's internal commentary, that was, and I understand she's just like a horrid, hateful character, hateful woman, but it felt a little bit like over the top. I don't know if I'm being naive here, but it just felt like a little bit much. And there were some other times too where it just felt like a little bit like, I feel like it would have been more effective if it would have been subtler maybe, but that's just my opinion, I guess. I don't know. I think I kind of almost feel like the more subtle commentary does a better job maybe. But like I said, I feel like it did really, one thing that it did comment on super well is like basically aging, ageism, all of that. I feel like people talk about like internalized misogyny, and that's totally a thing, but I feel like internalized ageism, honestly, probably maybe more prevalent and more insidious. Like, we have all of this hate for ourselves getting older, and this story really encapsulates that well and kind of pushes it into the realm of horror, and I loved that. I just wish some of the other stuff would have been toned down a little bit so that that could shine, because that was like the real horror of this story. And I almost feel like Stephen King was like at home in COVID writing this and had all of these frustrations, some of them totally understandable, but put them in this book where they kind of didn't like fit very well. And that's just like my opinion. I don't know, I just felt like he just put them in there to like get them out as like therapy or something. but it just didn't work. It felt shoehorned, it just felt awkward, and some of it I just think is gonna age kind of poorly, and maybe already is. But I don't know, you let me know if you've read it what your thoughts are, because I'm really interested. I felt like this had a lot of stuff that kind of took away from what was a really good horror story, and that's so unfortunate. That was such a bummer for me. It was interesting though. I loved the whole concept of how it was like all these different types of victims and the way that it unfolded. I don't know, I just loved this for Holly. I know it was like obviously an emotional journey for her in this story, but I really enjoyed watching her character get through this, and I felt like it was exactly the type of story that I did need with this character, so I appreciate that a lot. I don't know, those are kind of like my thoughts. I think overall well written, but I wish some of the distracting stuff would have been left out a little bit or toned down. But that's probably gonna be it for this review. Please like, please subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will see you soon for another book review.